Hey Braves, so this week we're talking about energy and life. Basically, we're going to look into two main equations that basically allow life to do all of the things that it's able to do. We're going to look into photosynthesis, which is how plants capture the sun's energy via its light and turns it into chemical energy in the form of glucose. And we're going to look at how all living things can then take that glucose and break it down into a chemical called ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, which is actually the fuel that your cells use to do and carry out all of their functions. So those are the two main equations that we're going to cover this week. Now, because the equation is very similar to cellular respiration, I'm throwing combustion in there this week as well. And combustion, the reason it's important, and the reason I include it in here, not only is it the same equation as cellular respiration, but it's one of the most important equations to human civilization. Without combustion, we never make it out of the Stone Age. In fact, without combustion, we have no way of warming our bodies in those drastically cold, wintry months in the northern hemispheres. Without combustion, we would not have been able to create fire. So we would not have been able to create things like the automobile and the internal combustion engine. We would not be able to generate electricity by burning coal or natural gas or other things. So combustion is incredibly important. And the funny thing is, the same equation is going on inside of our cells. So, it's kind of important to know. This little guy here is a plant, and to be specific, it's a succulent. Succulents in all plants are green because they have a chemical inside of them called chlorophyll. And chlorophyll is basically just a little chemical, it's a pigment, that's green, it's what makes it green, that captures the sunlight for plants. Pretty simple. And because of that chlorophyll, the plant is able to undergo the process of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is a process where CO2 is combined with water and sunlight to create sugar, or glucose, and oxygen. Now, you need 6 molecules of CO2, 6 molecules of water, and quite a bit of sunlight to create 1 molecule of glucose and 6 molecules of oxygen. This is why we rely on plants to give us the air that we breathe, the important oxygen that we need to survive, right? And this is also where we get all of our energy. If these little plants aren't out there making glucose, well then they don't have the things they need to build all of those other structures that plants have. If you guys remember carbohydrates, glucose is chained together to make things like fiber, which is what plants use to make all of their parts out of. Also too, the sugar, the glucose that are in these are what we break down when we eat things like fruit, or we eat things like spinach and other plant materials. And it's also where all the cows and herbivores get their energy. So when we're eating a cow, we're basically getting the energy they got from the plants. And the plants got that energy from the sun. Photosynthesis. Without it, we wouldn't be here. This thing right here is a cashew. And inside of it are things like glucose. Now, obviously, there's things like protein and lipids and other things. And when I eat this, my body is now going to go about digesting and breaking this down into its constituent parts. And it's going to take the molecules that the cell uses as energy, and it's going to metabolize them. That just means break them down into a useful form. And once it gets down into these smaller components, things like glucose, well then the mitochondria of the cell is going to take those and break them down further into something called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And ATP is the main unit of energy for the cell. Basically, glucose comes in as a big package of energy, and it has to be broken up into bits and turned into ATP so that the cell can use it. Once it's in the form of ATP, well, the cell goes about cutting off one of the phosphate groups at the end and turning it into ADP. Anytime you remove a phosphate from ATP, well, you're releasing energy. And again, that's what the cell is using to carry out all of its functions. Now, the process of cellular respiration is a lot more complicated than the simple equation that we generally use to represent it. There's several steps in between to make it work. However, to simplify, all cellular respiration is the reverse of the photosynthesis equation. if you take oxygen and you mix it with, say, a glucose molecule, what will happen is that glucose molecule will break back apart and yield CO2 and water. So the cool thing about life is plants go about creating glucose through photosynthesis, and then we creatures go along and eat those things that plants create and turn it right back into the parts that it was before. Now again, I did say it is quite a bit more complicated than just the stereotypical cellular respiration equation. I'm more concerned that you understand that photosynthesis and cellular respiration are basically the reverse of each other. And I'm more interested when we get into the minutiae, the extra steps in between. I want you to know how each step, how much ATP is generated, but I'm not going to have you memorize all of these complex chemical equations and steps. It's a lot even for me. So just relax when you're going through this and just try and understand what you can and see the path of the process that your cells have to go through to get energy out of the food that you eat. That's it. Don't worry. Exhale. It'll all be okay. So at the beginning of the video, I mentioned that combustion and cellular respiration are essentially the exact same thing. Now, the difference, like I said before, is that in cellular respiration, there's several different steps in order to get to the final part of the equation. However, with combustion, we don't need those extra steps. In fact, all we need is a spark of energy. If we have a fuel source in the form of a hydrocarbon, say methane or gasoline or cellulose, like a piece of paper, all we need to do is add oxygen from the air and a spark of energy. And what we will do is start breaking down the hydrocarbons, the different chains of C and H and O that we've talked about in macromolecules. Well, they just start breaking down, and they release their energy in the form of heat and light. And when you see a flame, this right here, what you are seeing is the energy being released as the fuel, the cellulose wood fibers of this match, begin to break down and turn into carbon dioxide and water. And that flame, all that is hot gas of water and CO2 being released into the air. It's actually not like a thing. You can't really touch a flame. It's just hot gas. That's all it is. Now, it doesn't just have to be wood. Any hydrocarbon will do for the combustion equation. For instance, if I take this match again and I light it and get my flame, if I take, say, that same cashew from before, well, I can go on ahead and set this cashew on fire because it has hydrocarbons in it. Protein, lipids, and carbohydrates are all hydrocarbons. They're a fuel source. So if I provide enough startup energy, I can have combustion begin to break this down and release the energy that's stored inside. This is what happens when we set things on fire, but this is also what happens inside of your cells. Pretty amazing. The same equation that we use for life, human beings have figured out how to release and use for all of our functions in our society today. Awesome stuff. I'm not going to eat that. So those are the basics of photosynthesis, cellular respiration, and combustion. Again, it's one basic equation, but three different processes. Again, before I get into that, I just want to make sure you understand. I'm not expecting you to memorize every step of this. Really, the point is to show you how complex the chemistry is inside of a cell to make this basic equation happen. And so you can kind of get a sense of awe, have your mind blown just a little bit, when you consider that, again, 10,000 cells can fit on the head of a pen, and there are hundreds of chloroplasts in some of these plant cells. So all of this complex chemistry is occurring in something impossibly tiny. And really, I want you to see how complex that process is to really kind of, blow your mind just a little bit. So I hope you enjoy this video. I try to keep it as short as I could. And with that, I'll see you later.